Martial arts are as old as the first humans who wrestled over the last slab of meat. Throughout history, all over the world, different kinds of martial arts have sprouted, evolved and flourished. When the world became more connected, people started wondering which one of these martial arts was actually the most effective. What kind of martial artist would win in a real fight? Which martial arts is the most viable for actual hand-to-hand combat? Through cross-training, Judo and the rise of the UFC, we slowly began to get a grasp on what is the most effective way of fighting. There may be no hard and fast rules to techniques, as different individuals can make different sets of techniques and strategies work in combat, but it became clear that the most successful martial artists actually engage in sparring, drilling against resisting opponents, and also engage in high-level physical conditioning. You need to actually build a fighting operating system through combat. Download it into your nervous system if you will. It's certainly gotten clear over time there's a set of best practices when it comes to martial arts training. Different martial arts have individual aspects that make it viable or less viable. Some are pretty close to actual fighting, while others are not suitable for actual combat at all. Most people are at least somewhat familiar with the concept of Judo. Let's take Judo as an example and take a look at the viable and non-viable aspects of Judo. So this is a list I put together of viable and non-viable aspects of Judo. On the left you see the viable aspects, on the right the non-viable aspects. Allow me to quickly go through them one by one. So the first aspect is that grappling arts are extremely viable in general. There was a time when grappling arts like wrestling and judo weren't even considered forms of fighting. The heavyweight boxing champ was considered the baddest man on the planet. But the first UFC changed a lot about that, by showing the effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The grappling arts wrestling and BJJ are still of giant importance in modern fighting and are considered the fundamental building blocks of a fighter. And although Judo is not considered to be at the same level of importance, it's still a very viable grappling art and a great addition to any fighter's skill set. Next up is the building up of grappling strength. This one's pretty straightforward. Judokas are tremendously strong. Years of throwing and controlling people builds a ridiculous grip strength, back strength, hip strength, all kinds of strength. Tossing people on their heads is badass and very effective. Training in Judo crafts very unique and dangerous weapons for a fighter. The focus on specific forms of takedowns on the feet make it unique. Years of trying to unbalance and trip opponents creates a specific skill set not seen in other grappling sports. Breaking falls is one of Judo's best kept secrets. Not getting hurt when being taken down is low-key of extreme importance. And if we're talking offensively, of course a well-timed throw can be absolutely devastating and end the fight lightning quick. The fourth viable aspect of Judo is that most judokas spar with full resistance every training session. Judo training consists of a whole lot of sparring. Within the rule set of Judo, judokas battle out a lot of rounds with full resistance, only holding back on some of the throws to prevent injury. Through these live rounds of battle, the judokas built the skill to perform their sport at the highest competitive level. Now we'll jump to the non-viable aspects of Judo. These aspects of Judo are not suitable for someone training for fighting. First up is the dependency on gi grips. Wearing a gi is a very big part of Judo. Judokas train day in, day out with specific grips on the gi. It's easy to imagine how much the absence of a gi would diminish the game of a judoka. When your entire game starts with a strong grip on the lapel, you'll have to adapt on the fly in a situation where the opponent is not wearing the gi. And before I get an inbox filled with messages about self-defense and winter coats, not a lot of outfits replicate the tough material and loose sleeves of the gi. There's a big difference there. But yes, a black belt in Judo is likely going to dominate an untrained person regardless of their wardrobe. But that has everything to do with the aspects on the left side of this list. The absence of a gi would still be a diminishing factor for the judoka. Second up are the restrictive rules and the sports focus of Judo. Many grappling techniques are not allowed in Judo. There are specific rules about grips and you are not allowed to grab the opponent's legs at all. This for one limits your own moveset as an offensive grappler, as there are parts of the game you don't master. So you're not drilling and learning the double leg technique in a judo class, for example. But even more importantly, you never train to defend against these prohibited forms of grappling. To stick with the example, you don't learn to sprawl and defend against a double leg. You can specialize offensively and still be very effective regardless, but specializing defensively is a liability and leaves you vulnerable. And lastly, there is zero striking. It's obvious there is no striking in a grappling sport, but Judo in specific is very far removed from the art of striking. In BJJ, you usually get at least some self-defense based classes involving striking. You maybe learn some basic defensive striking posture and to work yourself to a body lock. This is not common in Judo classes. In Judo, the rules actually actively forbid you to use feinting and footwork, which are of course some of the fundamentals of striking. So these were some of my ideas on the viability of Judo. I'm sure I missed some things, been a while since I did any Judo, but the point of this list was to illustrate how individual aspects of a martial art can be viable or not viable for fighting. And also to show how one could start to deduct what are viable parts of other martial arts, or perhaps even your own martial art. Let's stick with the Judo example for just another moment. If we're talking viability for fighting, a brown belt in Judo who trains some MMA on the side is much further along as an actual overall fighter than a black belt who only trains against other judokas. The black belt may have a higher level of Judo and beat the brown belt in a Judo match. But the brown belt has actually made some way in actually applying his Judo technique against fully resisting, unrestricted opponents. The power of training MMA for the brown belt judoka lies not necessarily in becoming a striker himself, although picking up techniques that are working for you is of course excellent, but it lies mostly in learning to apply his Judo to opponents who kick and wrestle and throw shots on the ground. You can force the viable aspects of your martial art to the surface by pressure testing it in this way. The reason I picked Judo as an example is because I think it has the most obvious distinction between what parts of it are viable for fighting and what parts are not. But all martial arts and combat sports suffer from at least a few aspects that aren't completely viable for actual hand-to-hand combat. Even MMA has its restrictions. What it comes down to with the viability of martial arts is that the more you are limited from an actual fight by the rules, the less viable your martial art will be. And the more static and removed from pressure testing your training is, the less effective your training will be.